never thought I would say this, but I, Tyler Brooks, will never RV camp in West Virginia again. What was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains turned into a nightmare I still can't shake. It started as a simple plan. At 32, I had just bought a second-hand RV, and I was eager to test it out on a solo trip. West Virginia's wilderness seemed like the perfect place to unwind, away from the stress of work and city life. The state is known for its breathtaking mountains, dense forests, and small, quiet towns. After a little research, I found a secluded campground that boasted tranquility and a true back-to-nature experience. I thought it would be the perfect place to reconnect with nature, to relax and escape the chaos of life. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, feeling optimistic and excited. The drive into the mountains was beautiful, winding roads, towering trees, and the scent of fresh pine in the air. The campground itself was tucked away deep in the woods, far from any other signs of life. When I pulled into my designated spot, I immediately felt the eerie stillness of the area. There were no other campers around, which I initially appreciated. It meant peace and quiet, but as the evening crept in, something felt off. The air was thick, and the forest seemed strangely quiet. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of the place. I set up my campfire, made some dinner, and settled in for a peaceful evening under the stars. But when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the night crept in, that's when things took a dark turn. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard the first strange sound. It was a low growl, almost like the sound of a large animal, but there was something unnatural about it. It wasn't the typical sounds of a bear or a coyote. It sounded deliberate, like it was trying to make itself heard. I stood still, listening, but the forest around me was dead silent again, almost like nothing had happened. Thinking it was just my imagination, I went back to my RV, locked the door, and tried to fall asleep. That's when the knocking started. At first, it was just a soft tap, followed by a pause, then more knocking, louder and more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get inside. My heart raced as I bolted upright in bed. I listened closely, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe it was just a tree branch hitting the side of the RV? Or perhaps an animal rummaging through the campsite. But then, the knocking grew harder, more forceful. The sound was coming from the door. I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the blinds, shining the light through the window, expecting to see nothing. But what I saw froze me in place. There, in the darkness, standing just outside the door, was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its features obscured. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was as if the very air around it had become cold and oppressive. I quickly backed away from the window, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no way to contact anyone for help. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, but eventually it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was as though the entire forest had gone mute, holding its breath again. I lay in my bed, wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the RV, certain that something was out there, watching me. The next morning, I decided I had to get out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't welcome in that forest, that something was lurking in the shadows. I went outside to pack up my things, but as I stepped out of the RV, I noticed something even more disturbing. The ground around my campsite was littered with strange, deep footprints, far too large to be from any normal animal. And they led into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I quickly packed up the RV, my hands shaking as I loaded everything inside. I had never felt so paranoid in my life. As I started the engine and drove away from the campground, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. I couldn't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I would never return to that place again. The woods in West Virginia had something unsettling about them, a presence I couldn't shake. I don't know what I encountered out there, but I do know one thing. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. Some places are better left unexplored. My name is Alex Walker, and I've been an avid photographer for as long as I can remember. My camera is my constant companion, whether I'm traveling the world or camping in secluded spots. I've always enjoyed the quiet of nature, the way it can feel like you're the only one there. That's why when I decided to RV camp in West Virginia, I thought it would be the perfect getaway. A chance to explore the mountains and capture some of the area's stunning, untamed beauty. But that trip changed everything, and I'll never go back. I found a small, remote RV park on the edge of the Monongahela National Forest. It was isolated, with just a few other RVs scattered around, and I figured it would be the perfect place to get some unique shots of the forest and wildlife. The scenery was exactly as I had hoped. Tall trees, winding streams, and rolling hills. Everything looked picturesque, almost too perfect. But as soon as I set up my RV and began to venture out with my camera, I began to feel off. There was something strange about the place, like the air was thick with something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I spent the day hiking around the area, snapping pictures of the dense woods, the streams, and the unusual fog that rolled in over the hills. I got some great shots of wildlife, too. A deer grazing near a creek, birds flying low over the water, and even a family of raccoons near the edge of the forest. As the light started to fade, I returned to my RV, ready to go through the day's photos. That's when things started to get strange. I sat down at the small table inside the RV, hooked up my camera to my laptop, and began going through the images. The first few shots were beautiful. Soft, golden light filtering through the trees, mist rising from the creek. Then I came across a photo that I didn't remember taking. It was a shot of a narrow path in the forest, framed by tall trees on either side. There was nothing particularly unusual about it at first glance, but as I zoomed in on the photo, I felt my heart skip a beat. In the distance, just at the edge of the path, there was a figure. It was blurry, almost like a shadow, but it was unmistakable, a tall, thin shape, standing motionless among the trees. I hadn't seen anyone there when I took the shot, and I certainly hadn't noticed anything while I was on the path. I stared at the photo, trying to figure out if it was just a trick of the light or some weird reflection, but the more I looked at it, the more real it seemed. I quickly moved on to the next photo, and that's when I saw it again. The figure was in the background of several shots, always in the same place, standing motionless just off the trail, partially obscured by the trees. But in each photo, it looked slightly different. In one, it was closer. In another, it appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Its features barely visible, but its presence undeniable. I was sure I hadn't seen anything when I was out there. I had walked down that trail alone. There was no one around. The feeling of unease I had been experiencing all day came rushing back. I quickly closed my laptop and went outside, trying to shake off the paranoia that was creeping in. I walked around the RV park, checked the area by the path, but found nothing. Just trees and more trees. I convinced myself it was a fluke. Maybe some strange optical illusion caused by the lighting or a bug on the lens. But I couldn't ignore the fact that I was seeing something in those photos that wasn't there in real life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure in the photos. It wasn't just a shadow. It looked like a person. A tall, gaunt figure standing in the trees, waiting. I kept replaying the photos in my head, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but nothing made sense. I had been alone out there. There was no one else. The park was isolated. The figure wasn't something I could explain away. The next day, I decided to head out again, determined to figure out what was going on. I took my camera, hoping to capture more shots, but as soon as I set foot on the same path where I had taken the photos, a heavy sense of dread settled over me. I walked the same route, retracing my steps, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No figures in the distance, no odd shadows, just the quiet of the forest. It wasn't until I was walking back to my RV that I saw it. In the distance, just on the edge of the trees, I saw something move. It was too far to make out clearly, but I swear I saw a figure standing in the same spot as in the photos. I froze, my heart pounding. I raised my camera and zoomed in, hoping to catch a better shot. But as soon as I clicked the shutter, the figure vanished, just gone. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know who or what I was seeing in those photos, but after that experience, I packed up my RV and left. I couldn't explain it. The strange figure, the unsettling feeling, the way the photos captured something that wasn't there. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never RV camp in West Virginia again. My name is Mark Sullivan, and I've been an avid RV camper for over a decade. I've traveled across the country, from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Oregon, seeking solitude and adventure in every nook of the United States. But there is one place I will never return to, West Virginia. After my experience there, I swear I'll never RV camp in that state again. It was supposed to be an escape, a weekend of peace and serenity in the Appalachian Mountains. West Virginia has always intrigued me, with its rugged beauty and remote charm. So, one Friday, I loaded up my RV, packed my gear, and set off for a campground I had found online, nestled deep within the mountains. The reviews all spoke about how quiet and secluded it was, how it was the perfect place to get away from the world. I thought it sounded like heaven. The drive in was stunning. The winding roads, the towering trees, and the steep ridges of the mountains made me feel like I was entering a completely different world. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the light, and the silence became almost deafening. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. When I arrived at the campground, I immediately noticed something odd. There were no other campers. It was a Friday evening, and yet the place was deserted. The empty campground should have been a sign, but I brushed it off. I parked my RV, hooked up the water and electricity, and decided to take a walk through the area. The campground itself was old, with cracked concrete and rusting metal picnic tables. It felt abandoned, but I told myself it was just an off-the-beaten-path kind of place. As night fell, I started a fire and settled in with a book. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and the darkness enveloped everything. The only light was the flickering flames and the stars above. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But as the fire crackled, I began to hear strange noises in the woods. Soft rustling, like something was moving through the brush. But when I looked, I saw nothing. It was the kind of sound that puts you on edge, the kind that makes you think you're being followed. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sounds grew louder and closer. My heart started to race. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, and the silence that followed was unnerving. I stood up and scanned the darkness around me, but there was nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I rushed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried to dismiss the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made me jump. I heard something outside again, a faint tapping, like something was scratching at the side of the RV. I froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more persistent, until it felt like it was right next to the window. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and cautiously pulled back the blinds. My heart nearly stopped when I saw a dark figure standing just outside the RV. It wasn't a person, but something tall and shadowy, its form obscured by the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its presence, looming just beyond the glass. I flashed the light toward it, and it immediately disappeared into the night, vanishing without a trace. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking as I sat back down on the bed, too scared to move. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't care how early it was or how much I'd paid for the campsite. I had to get out of there. As I was breaking camp, I noticed something even stranger. The ground around my RV was disturbed. The dirt was scratched up, as if something had been digging around my tires. There were no signs of animals, just deep, claw-like marks in the soil. I couldn't explain it. The air felt heavy, and every instinct in my body told me to leave, so I did. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked in my rearview mirror 100 times, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. The forest was still and silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Something in that campground had made its mark on me, and I couldn't ignore it. I'll never forget that feeling, the sensation of being so completely alone, and yet not alone at all. It was as if the forest itself had a presence, a dark energy that watched me the entire time I was there. No amount of beauty or isolation is worth the creeping dread that I felt in those woods. I swore that day, with every ounce of conviction, that I would never RV camp in West Virginia again. There are plenty of other beautiful places in this country, and I don't need to revisit that one. Whatever was lurking in those mountains, I don't want to find out. I've always loved the idea of RV camping. The freedom to explore the outdoors while having the comforts of home on wheels was an adventure I couldn't resist. But after one disastrous trip to West Virginia, I swore I'd never set foot in that state for an RV camping trip again. Here's why. It all started with my excitement for a weekend getaway in the wild hills of West Virginia. The plan was simple: find a secluded spot to set up camp, enjoy nature, and get some much-needed relaxation. I mapped out a few remote RV-friendly campgrounds and hit the road with high hopes. We arrived in the area late in the afternoon, the sky streaked with a soft, golden hue. The landscape was exactly what I had envisioned: tall trees, steep hills, and a tranquil, serene atmosphere. But from the moment we pulled into the campground, something felt off. The site was supposed to be quiet and peaceful, but it was anything but. The first issue arose when we tried to level the RV. The terrain was so uneven, we had to use nearly every leveling block we had in the RV just to keep it from tilting too badly. That should have been my first sign to leave, but I pushed on, determined to enjoy the weekend. By nightfall, things started to take a turn for the worse. The wind kicked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature dropped much lower than I had anticipated. But it wasn't just the cold that kept me on edge. The noises from the surrounding forest started to feel unnatural. Strange rustlings and animal calls echoed through the night, louder than I was used to. It sounded like something was moving in the woods right behind our RV. I decided to investigate the source of the sounds, grabbing a flashlight and heading into the dark woods. But when I shone the light around, I saw nothing. Only shadows shifting in the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. Every creak of the RV or rustle of the leaves sent my heart racing. I chalked it up to being in unfamiliar territory and tried to go back to sleep. That's when the storm hit. A violent rainstorm rolled in around 2 a.m. The winds howled even harder, and I could hear the sound of branches snapping in the distance. I jumped up, rushing to secure the awning, but before I could, I heard a loud thud. Something large hit the side of the RV. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure if it was a falling branch or something worse. At this point, the entire campground seemed to be alive with noise. Gusting winds, trees creaking, and what sounded like something heavy moving through the forest. We decided to pack up and leave, but our trouble wasn't over. The next morning, as we tried to start the RV and drive out, we found that the road leading out of the campground had flooded. The rain had turned the dirt roads into a slippery, muddy mess. I spent over an hour trying to get the RV unstuck, but no matter what I did, the wheels just kept spinning. I had to call for a tow, and after a long, stressful wait, we finally managed to get back on the road. The whole experience was exhausting, frustrating, and downright terrifying at times. By the time we were safely back on the highway, I was completely done. The remote beauty of West Virginia had quickly turned into a nightmare, from the difficult terrain to the unnerving sounds at night and the chaotic storm that made everything worse. I love camping, and I love exploring new places, but after that trip, I learned that some places just aren't worth the risk. West Virginia may be beautiful, but it's not a place I would ever choose for RV camping again. I learned the hard way that sometimes the wilds of nature don't always offer the peaceful escape you expect. So, for anyone considering RV camping in West Virginia, think twice. It might look like the perfect adventure on paper, but be prepared for the unexpected. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. My name is James Carter, and I've been camping for most of my life. I've been on countless trips across the country, but after what happened in West Virginia, I can safely say that I'll never RV camp in that state again. This story is one I've never told anyone, but I think it's time to get it off my chest. It all started with a solo trip. I had just bought a new RV, and I was eager to try it out. West Virginia seemed like the perfect place for an adventure, a little remote, but full of natural beauty. The plan was simple. Park my RV near a small, tucked-away campground, enjoy some hiking, and spend a few nights in the wild. No distractions, just me and the mountains. I found a campground off the beaten path. It was near a river, surrounded by dense forests and distant hills. No other campers were listed for the weekend, which only added to its appeal. I could already hear the gentle flow of the river as I pulled into my spot and set up. The first few hours were fantastic. The air was crisp, the scenery breathtaking, and I felt completely at ease. As night fell, I made myself some dinner, started a small campfire, and sat outside watching the stars. It was peaceful, with only the sounds of the river and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. But as the fire began to die down and the night grew colder, I started hearing something unusual, a loud, rhythmic thud, thud, thud from the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking branches or the rustle of small animals, but it wasn't. It was too consistent, almost deliberate. It sounded like something heavy was walking or pounding its way through the forest, and it was coming closer to my campsite. I stood still, straining to hear. The noise stopped, but only for a few seconds. Then it started again, this time closer, almost right on the edge of the trees surrounding my RV. Thud, thud, thud. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Bears? No, the sound was too rhythmic. A large animal? It was possible, but this felt different. This wasn't an animal. It was something else, something purposeful. I quickly moved inside the RV, locking the door and turning off the lights. I sat there, my heart pounding, listening intently. The thudding continued for what seemed like an eternity, getting louder, but never close enough for me to see anything. It was as if whatever was out there knew exactly where I was, but was choosing to stay hidden. The whole night passed in that strange, tense silence between the thuds. When morning came, I couldn't get out of the RV fast enough. I stepped outside cautiously, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The entire perimeter of my campsite was surrounded by deep, nearly perfect indentations in the ground, as if something heavy had circled me during the night. I walked around the campsite, inspecting the strange marks in the dirt. They were too big and too deliberate to be from any animal I knew of. But the most unsettling part? They were fresh, like they had been made overnight after I'd gone to bed. I quickly packed up my gear, wanting to leave the area as fast as I could. As I was about to start the RV and drive away, I looked down at the ground again, only to see a large, twisted branch lying in front of my tire, almost as if placed there deliberately. There was no storm the night before, no reason for that branch to be in front of the RV. It took me another hour to get the branch cleared and the RV back on the road. As I drove away from the campground, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something following me from the woods, but there was nothing. Just the same dense trees and the lingering sense of unease that clung to me like a heavy fog. I've since talked to other campers who've been to that area, and I'm not the first one to have felt something off about it. Some of them even told me they'd heard the same pounding sounds late at night, but nobody could explain what it was. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was something else. But I know one thing for sure. That campground is not a place I ever want to visit again. There are plenty of other places to camp in the wild, places that don't give me the feeling that something, or someone, is watching me from the trees. I don't need to go back to West Virginia, not after what I experienced. So, I made a promise to myself after that trip. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. The woods there have a way of messing with your mind, and I'm done trying to figure out what's lurking in the dark corners of the forest. Camping in an RV was supposed to be a perfect way to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. After all, what could go wrong when you're driving through the mountains of West Virginia, ready to park, hike, and enjoy the beauty of nature? Little did I know that the peaceful, idyllic adventure I had in mind would turn into a nightmare that left me swearing I'd never RV camp in that state again. It all started with a simple idea, an escape to the quiet corners of the Appalachian Mountains. I had heard stories of the breathtaking views, rolling hills, and secluded campsites that West Virginia offered. The plan was clear. Drive to a remote campground, set up the RV, spend a couple of days hiking and enjoying nature, and leave the world behind. What I didn't account for, however, was how much nature had in store for me. The drive there was picturesque. As we passed through small towns, winding roads, and dense forests, the excitement grew. The air was crisp, the sky was blue, and the promise of a peaceful getaway felt almost tangible. But as we turned off the main highway and onto a smaller, more rugged road, the first signs of trouble began to emerge. The road narrowed, twisting and climbing, with sharp turns and steep inclines. The RV, while sturdy, struggled with the steep grades, and I found myself gripping the wheel, trying to keep control as we climbed higher and higher. By the time we reached the campground, it was late afternoon. The campground was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees, with a view of a quiet stream running through it. I was immediately taken in by the beauty and seclusion, the perfect place to unwind. But as I pulled into our campsite and began to set up, I realized the terrain wasn't as RV-friendly as I had hoped. The ground was uneven, the site was small, and there wasn't enough space to park the RV without a bit of maneuvering. Still, we made it work, settling in with the intention of enjoying the evening by the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange stillness fell over the campsite. It was too quiet. There was no wind, no animal sounds, just the faint rustle of leaves as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease, lighting the campfire and settling in for a relaxing evening. But the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt unnatural. That night, as I lay in bed inside the RV, I kept hearing strange noises outside, creaks, scrapes, and faint whispers of movement. I dismissed it as the wind, though it didn't explain the strange scraping sound that seemed to be coming from the side of the RV. Was it an animal? A branch brushing against the side? I couldn't tell. My mind raced, and sleep seemed impossible. The next morning, things only got worse. When I stepped outside to check the surroundings, I immediately noticed something was off. The trail leading to the stream had been trampled, as if something heavy had passed through the area. Large footprints, unmistakable and unnervingly human-sized, were imprinted in the soft mud. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't make sense. Who could have walked through here, and why? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper, or maybe an animal had wandered through. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something was wrong. The footprints led toward the thick forest, disappearing into the underbrush. With an uneasy feeling settling in my chest, I decided to head to the office and ask the campground hosts if they'd seen anything unusual. But when I arrived, there was no one in sight. The office was locked, and the grounds were eerily quiet. That afternoon, I took a walk to try and shake off my growing paranoia. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the more I felt like something was following me. At times, I could hear faint footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. It was as though the woods had closed in around me. The path became narrow, the trees more dense, and the sounds of the forest grew louder. But there was something else, something out of place. I turned back toward the RV, but before I could make it, I was caught in a sudden violent storm. It started with a light drizzle, then quickly escalated into torrential rain. Winds picked up, howling through the trees. I barely made it back to the RV, drenched and shaken, just as the storm hit in full force. The next few hours were a blur of rain, thunder, and wind. The RV rocked violently in the storm, the gusts of wind causing the trees to sway dangerously close to us. I could hear branches snapping, the sound of something heavy crashing against the ground. It felt like the forest itself was alive, angry, restless, and determined to push us out. But it wasn't until the power went out that I truly felt trapped. The RV went dark, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning. The storm raged outside, and I heard what I could only describe as footsteps circling the RV. Heavy, deliberate steps, as though something large and ominous was walking around us, studying us. It wasn't just the storm or the wind anymore. Something was out there. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched, of something sinister lurking just beyond the reach of the dim light, was overwhelming. By the time the storm finally died down, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my bones. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. We packed up, leaving behind the eerie campsite and the unsettling feeling that had followed us throughout the trip. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the dense forest, the dark woods that felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. I swore that day I would never RV camp in West Virginia again. There was something about that place. Its isolation, its silence, its unnerving stillness that I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was just bad luck, or maybe it was something more, but either way, I wasn't willing to find out. West Virginia might have its charms, but as for RV camping, not for me, never again. When I first decided to go RV camping in West Virginia, I had this idyllic vision of a quiet weekend getaway in the Appalachian Mountains. I had heard so much about its beautiful, untouched landscapes, and I imagined myself enjoying the crisp air, peaceful nights, and the rugged charm of the forest. Little did I know that my trip would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, leaving me with an unshakable vow: I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. It all started as a spontaneous idea. I had recently bought an RV, eager to explore the great outdoors and get away from the daily grind. West Virginia, with its wild forests and remote beauty, seemed like the perfect destination. After researching a few campgrounds online, I found one that promised seclusion and serenity, away from the hustle and bustle of modern life. The reviews spoke of breathtaking views, lush greenery, and peaceful nights under the stars. It was a dream come true. We hit the road on a Thursday morning, my friend and I excited to see what West Virginia had in store. As we made our way into the mountains, the scenery was indeed stunning. The drive itself was beautiful. Twisting roads, steep hills, and valleys so green they looked like something out of a postcard. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, I began to notice something odd. The further we drove, the more isolated the landscape became. The towns grew sparse, and cell service became non-existent. That should have been the first warning sign. When we finally arrived at the campground, the site was picturesque, with towering trees and a crystal-clear stream running through the area. However, the campground itself looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The site was overgrown with weeds, and the RV spaces were cramped and uneven. It was almost as if the place had been abandoned and forgotten by time. Despite these signs, we decided to set up camp, eager to experience the wilderness. The first night wasn't so bad. The air was fresh, and the sounds of the forest were soothing, at least until we went to bed. That's when things started to take a strange turn. Around midnight, I woke up to a low, guttural sound coming from outside the RV. It wasn't the typical sounds of nature I was used to. No birds, no crickets, no wind rustling through the trees. It sounded like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I tried to dismiss it as an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. I peered out the window but saw nothing. The forest around us was dark, and the moonlight barely filtered through the trees. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, we decided to hike through the woods and explore the area. We had heard rumors from other campers about strange occurrences in the forest, but we didn't pay much attention. After all, What's a good camping trip without a little bit of mystery, right? As we walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere became oddly tense. The air felt thick, and the further we went, the quieter everything became. It was as if the forest itself had gone mute. The only sounds we could hear were our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. An old abandoned cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The windows were shattered, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the roof had long since caved in. We couldn't resist checking it out, so we approached cautiously. As we got closer, I noticed strange markings on the trees around the cabin. Symbols carved deep into the bark. They didn't look like anything I recognized, and they sent a chill down my spine. We didn't linger, but as we turned to leave, I saw something that froze me in place. A figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching us. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, and unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I rushed back to the RV, feeling as though we were being watched the entire way. I didn't say anything to my friend, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I knew something was wrong. That night, the air turned cold, and the wind picked up. Around midnight, we heard it again. The same low, guttural noise, closer this time. I told my friend I was going to check it out. We were parked near the edge of the woods, and I grabbed a flashlight, determined to figure out what was causing the noise. The moment I stepped outside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The forest was unnervingly still. No breeze, no sounds of night creatures. Just silence. As I walked toward the trees, the noise stopped. Everything felt wrong. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure darting between the trees. My heart raced. It was tall, humanoid, but there was something off about its movement. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally fast, like it was floating just above the ground. I froze, shining the flashlight toward it, but it disappeared into the forest. My breath caught in my throat, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I rushed back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, and told my friend what had happened. We were both terrified. The next morning, we found that the campsite was even more eerie. Our things had been disturbed. The cooler was open, food was missing, and the RV door had been left slightly ajar. It wasn't just animals. There were no tracks, no signs of anything that could have gotten in. It was as if someone had been in the RV, rummaging through our things while we slept. We packed up and left immediately. I didn't care about the money I'd spent on the trip. I just wanted to get out of there. As we drove out of the campground, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. We never spoke of it again, but I knew deep down that West Virginia's forests held something more sinister than what we had bargained for. From the abandoned cabin to the strange figure in the woods and the unexplained events around the campsite, it became clear that we were not welcome there. I vowed right then and there I would never RV camp in West Virginia again. The mountains and forests of that state had a dark secret, one that I was not willing to uncover. I'm sure there are beautiful places in West Virginia, but I learned the hard way that sometimes it's best to stay away from the places that seem too remote, too quiet, and too perfect to be true. My name is Nathan Reed, and I've always been the type of person to embrace solitude, especially when it comes to camping. I've spent countless nights under the stars in places all across the U.S., but there's one place I'll never return to: West Virginia. After spending 3 nights in a remote RV campground there, I made a vow to never go back. It all started innocently enough. I'd just finished a long stretch of work, and decided it was time to unwind with a solo camping trip. West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains had always intrigued me, so I found a small remote RV park nestled in the woods near a river. The reviews were good, and the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature, sounded perfect. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, excited for the weekend ahead. The campground was quiet, almost eerily so. There were only a handful of RVs, all parked far apart. I chose a spot by the river, set up my camp, and went for a hike. The fresh mountain air and the sound of the river were incredibly soothing. The landscape was gorgeous, with towering trees and mist rising from the water. It felt like the perfect escape from everything. That first night, I sat by the campfire and watched the stars above. As the fire crackled and the shadows grew long, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but I felt a constant sense of being observed. The wind rustled the trees in a way that felt unnatural, almost deliberate, and every so often I'd hear a soft thud or a snap, as if someone or something was walking just out of sight. I shook it off and went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every noise seemed louder than it should have been. The RV creaked in the night, and the silence between the wind gusts felt too deep. I decided to dismiss it as normal camp anxiety, and promised myself that the next night would be better. Night 2. The second night was when things started to get strange. I spent the day hiking along the river, enjoying the beauty of the landscape. But as dusk began to fall, I felt that same unsettling presence again. I had just finished cooking dinner when I heard a low, distant sound. A voice? A whisper? It was so faint that I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be another camper. But as I walked around the campground, I didn't find anyone. It was just me and the trees. I felt an increasing sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the remoteness of the location. People talk about how isolated places like this can get to your mind after a while. Still, as night crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I settled in for another quiet night, but around midnight I woke to an eerie, rhythmic tapping on the side of my RV. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't rain, it was something else, something deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Each one echoed in the otherwise quiet night, sending a chill down my spine. My first thought was that it could be an animal, but the sound didn't make sense. The tapping was too regular, too methodical. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the windows, but I saw nothing. Still, the tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent. Eventually, it stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I barely slept the rest of the night, lying awake, listening for any sign of movement. I was beginning to wonder if I was just imagining things, but the unease lingered. By the third night, I was ready to leave. I should have packed up and gone home earlier, but something about this place was keeping me there. It was almost like I was waiting for something to happen. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to finish what I started. As I sat by the campfire, trying to push aside my growing paranoia, the sound of footsteps reached my ears. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the woods just beyond the campground. The steps were heavy, but not the sound of a normal animal. They were too loud, too human. I froze, listening intently. Tap, 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 just like before. This time, I wasn't about to investigate. I ran to the RV, locked the door, and pulled down the shades. The tapping continued, but now it was joined by an odd scratching sound, like nails running along the side of the RV. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, hoping whatever was out there would go away. The sounds lasted for what felt like hours. But then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. the world outside was still, completely silent. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my heart racing. At some point, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't restful. I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could, barely looking around as I hooked up my RV and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back at the empty campground, now bathed in the soft light of dawn. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I never wanted to experience it again. The woods, the river, and the isolation of West Virginia had crept under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. The sensation of being watched, of hearing things I couldn't explain, would stay with me forever. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. Those 3 nights were enough to make me swear off the state for good. There are too many other places to explore, places that don't come with the same unsettling feeling that West Virginia gave me. Maybe it was just bad luck, but I'd rather not take any chances. My name is Jason Matthews, and I've always been an adventurer at heart. Whether it's hiking deep in the forest, fishing in remote lakes, or setting up camp in secluded spots, I've done it all. But after one trip to West Virginia, I learned a valuable lesson. There are some places you just shouldn't camp. And this was one of them. It started with a simple idea, a peaceful RV camping trip in the woods of West Virginia. I found a small, secluded RV park hidden deep in the mountains, far away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. The reviews were solid, and the photos online were breathtaking. Lush forests, mist-covered valleys, and the sound of a babbling creek. It seemed like the perfect getaway. Little did I know it would become the most unsettling experience of my life. Upon arrival, the campground seemed picturesque at first, isolated and surrounded by towering trees, with a faint trail leading off toward the river. The air was crisp, and the whole place had a quiet serenity about it. After setting up my RV and having a brief walk around, I felt relaxed, even if the silence was a little heavier than I was used to. No other campers were in sight, but that didn't bother me. It just made the place feel even more remote, like my own personal sanctuary in the wilderness. However, as night fell, something changed. At first, it was just a feeling, a strange tension in the air that I couldn't quite shake. It felt like the trees themselves were watching me, the dark shadows moving in ways that didn't feel natural. I couldn't explain it, but every time I stepped outside the RV, I felt eyes on me. I brushed it off and went inside for the night, locking the door and pulling the shades. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, a product of being in such an isolated place. But then, around what I estimated to be the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise, something that sounded like a soft, raspy breath. It came from just outside my RV. I froze, holding my breath. There it was again. A soft, wheezing exhale as if someone was standing inches from my window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. I couldn't make out any shapes or shadows in the darkness, but I was certain I wasn't alone. The breathing continued, ragged and slow, growing louder as if whatever it was had drawn closer. Panic set in and I grabbed my flashlight. I shined it through the blinds and out into the night, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. Yet the sound of the breathing didn't stop. It lingered, filling the silence around me, making every muscle in my body tense with fear. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there, paralyzed, hoping whatever it was would go away. Eventually, the sound faded, and I managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, my nerves on edge. The next morning, I figured it was just my imagination running wild. It was a strange experience, but I convinced myself it was nothing. However, when I went to start the RV, I noticed something off. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. The dirt was dug up in several places, as if something had been scratching at the earth. I didn't want to dwell on it too much, but it felt odd. That night, I was determined to stay calm. I double-checked all the locks, closed the blinds, and even left a light on for comfort. But as I tried to drift off to sleep, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low, gravelly voice, not loud, but close. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like whispers in the dark, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The voice seemed to come from just outside the RV, close enough that I could almost hear the person's breath. I stayed completely still, my eyes wide open in the dark. The whispers stopped for a moment, but then came a soft tap, tap, tap on the RV window. Slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the glass. I wasn't sure if I should check, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I simply lay there, motionless, hoping the night would pass quickly. Eventually, the sound stopped again, but sleep was impossible. The tension in the air was unbearable, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I spent the rest of the night in a half-sleep, constantly on edge, listening for the next sound, the next sign that I wasn't alone. The final morning, I wasted no time packing up. My nerves were shot, and I just wanted to leave. As I drove away from the campground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me from the trees. The whole experience felt wrong, like the forest itself had a presence that I couldn't explain. I'll never know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe the place was haunted, or maybe it was something else entirely. But after those terrifying experiences, one thing was for sure. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I'm a professional photographer. I've traveled to some of the most breathtaking and remote places in the world to capture stunning landscapes, wildlife, and the hidden beauty of nature. But after my recent trip to West Virginia, I'm not sure I can bring myself to return. Not after what I experienced. It all started with an assignment I received for a travel magazine. The editor wanted a series of photographs from one of the most remote areas in the Appalachian region, a region steeped in mystery and natural beauty. West Virginia was perfect. I researched the area and found a secluded RV campground nestled deep within the mountains. It was exactly the kind of place I needed for the ethereal, atmospheric shots the magazine wanted. I arrived at the campground and was immediately taken aback by the beauty of the place. The towering trees, the mist rising from the ground, and the sounds of a distant creek. It felt like stepping into a different world. The place was isolated, just me and a few other RVs scattered across the sprawling site. I knew I had to take advantage of the solitude, so I unpacked my camera gear and set off to explore. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. I snapped photos of the dense forest, the river, and even managed to catch a deer in the distance. The air was crisp, and there was a sense of calm, unlike anything I had ever experienced. As evening approached, the mist thickened, and the fading light created an eerie atmosphere. It was the kind of scene that made you feel like you were stepping into a ghost story. I couldn't wait to capture it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back at my RV, editing the day's photos. I had planned to head out early the next morning, but something kept me awake, the feeling that the forest outside was alive, that it was watching me. I told myself it was just the stillness of the place, that it was the kind of environment that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I heard what I could only describe as a soft whispering, like voices carried by the wind. It wasn't the rustling of trees, and it wasn't an animal. I stood up from my desk, listening intently. The sound was coming from outside, near the edge of the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV, shining the beam into the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, no shadows. Just the quiet, heavy air, but the whispers didn't stop. They continued, low and distant, as if the forest itself was speaking. My heart started racing. I knew I wasn't imagining things. There was something else out there. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but the whispers seemed to grow louder, as if moving closer. I quickly retreated into the RV and locked the door. The sounds stopped for a while, but I couldn't get any sleep that night. I kept my camera close, half expecting to catch something in my lens that would explain what was happening. The next day, I tried to push the previous night's events out of my mind. I spent the day photographing the creek, capturing the fog rolling over the rocks, and snapping photos of the eerie landscape. As I was photographing the trees at sunset, I noticed something strange. There was a shape in the distance, just standing there among the trees, motionless. I zoomed in with my camera, trying to get a better shot, but the shape was too far away, and I couldn't make it out. It didn't look like any animal I'd seen, nor did it resemble a person. It was simply there. I thought I might be seeing things, so I moved closer, hoping to catch a better shot. As I neared the shape, it disappeared. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The forest felt even more suffocating, like the air was thick with something I couldn't identify. I snapped a few more photos, but every shot seemed to capture a strange blur, like something was out of focus in the frame. I was unsettled, but chalked it up to the fading light in my tired mind. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw the shape again, this time standing outside my RV. But this time, it wasn't just standing. It was moving toward me, slowly and deliberately. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the figure get closer. It was tall, thin, and draped in shadows. I couldn't make out its face, but it seemed like it was coming straight for me. In a panic, I grabbed my camera and took a photo through the window. The flash illuminated the figure, and for just a second I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes staring back at me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I locked the door and stayed in the RV, clutching my camera. The figure never approached again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go out and take any more photos. I tried to leave the campground, but the road out was blocked by a fallen tree. I was stuck there, alone, with whatever that thing was lurking nearby. I spent the rest of the day pacing inside the RV, checking the locks, and peering out the windows. But the figure never appeared again. That night I decided I had enough. I packed up my gear and left before the sun set. As I drove down the winding road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The campground was still there, but it felt miles away. The whispering, the figure, it all felt too real. I never did find out what it was. Was it a shadow, a figment of my imagination? I don't know. But whatever it was, it terrified me enough that I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. My name is Ethan Miller, and I've always been a fan of the outdoors, the quiet, the solitude, and the beauty of nature. I've spent countless nights camping, hiking, and RVing across the country, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered in West Virginia. After that trip, I swore I would never return to that place again. I had been looking for a new location for a solo camping adventure, and West Virginia seemed like the perfect choice. The state is known for its rugged mountains and deep forests, which were exactly the kind of terrain I enjoyed exploring. I found a small RV park tucked away in a remote area, far from any civilization. There were no other reviews, no visitors. It was a hidden gem. Or at least, that's what I thought. When I arrived, the place was more isolated than I imagined. The RV park was surrounded by dense woods, and a river ran through the far side of the property. The only sound I could hear was the rush of the water and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I set up camp, made some coffee, and wandered into the woods to scout out some good photo spots. The further I walked into the forest, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew thick, and the trees became denser, as if the woods were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to take a photo or enjoy the scenery, the silence felt wrong. It was too quiet. There were no animals, no rustling of leaves, no breeze. It was as if everything in the forest had gone still. When I returned to my RV later that afternoon, the unease intensified. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but when I stepped inside and closed the door, I heard something odd. There was a soft, repetitive scratching noise, like claws dragging along metal. I froze, my heart racing. It was coming from the side of my RV, just outside the window. I grabbed my flashlight and crept over to the window, shining the beam into the dark. Nothing. There was no one there, no animal, no person, just darkness. But the scratching continued. I quickly checked the area around the RV, but again, nothing. I convinced myself it must have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but the sound was too deliberate, too persistent. I locked the doors, pulled the blinds, and tried to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The entire night was filled with strange noises. Tapping on the RV walls, soft footsteps circling the perimeter, and faint whispers carried by the wind. Every time I opened the door to check, nothing was there. But I could feel that something was lurking just beyond the light. I barely slept that night, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me, and I kept my camera close, hoping to capture something, anything, to explain what was happening. I even set up a few trail cameras around the RV, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But nothing showed up on the footage. No animals, no signs of movement. Yet, the sounds persisted, louder, more frequent, and more urgent as the night wore on. The next morning, I decided to take a break and leave the RV park for a bit, hoping that the change of scenery would calm my nerves. But as I drove down the narrow, winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something. A shadow moving in the trees, just out of view. At one point, I stopped to take a photo of a beautiful overlook, and when I turned around, the RV was gone, vanished. I immediately panicked, thinking I had driven off and left it behind. But when I drove back, the RV was exactly where I had left it. The unsettling presence of whatever was out there had followed me, and I couldn't escape it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, with eyes everywhere, waiting for me to make a mistake. That's when I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear in record time, locked everything down, and drove out of that RV park as fast as I could. As I left the woods behind, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The trees seemed to close in on the road, and I swear I saw figures moving among them, shadows that shouldn't have been there. I haven't been back to West Virginia since. I've traveled to many other places, but the memory of that night lingers, and I know I'll never RV camp there again. Some places are best left undisturbed. And that one, with its eerie silence and unsettling presence, will always haunt me. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. My husband, Mark, and I, both nature lovers, wanted to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life and spend some time relaxing in the woods. When we found an RV park in West Virginia, tucked away near the Appalachian Mountains, we thought it was the perfect spot. Secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. It sounded like paradise. But what we didn't know was that our trip would turn into a nightmare. We arrived at the RV park on a cool evening, set up our camp, and immediately felt a sense of serenity. The park was small, only a handful of RVs scattered around, and we were the only couple there that night. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled the air. It was beautiful. After a long day of driving, we set up a fire, made some dinner, and settled in for a peaceful evening under the stars. But something wasn't quite right. As the evening went on, I noticed how eerily quiet the forest was. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves in the wind, nothing. It was unnervingly still. Mark didn't seem bothered by it, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of the forest, but the feeling lingered. Later that night, after we went to bed, I woke up to a strange noise outside the RV. It sounded like soft footsteps, like someone walking around the campsite. I nudged Mark awake, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably just an animal. I didn't believe it. The steps were too deliberate, too human. We listened for a while, but the noise stopped. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I noticed that the RV's windows were fogged up, and I was sure we hadn't left them that way. It seemed strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, we had been in the woods, and humidity could do funny things. But as we stepped outside to enjoy the morning sun, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were strange marks in the dirt around our RV. It looked like someone, or something, had been circling it. Large, deep impressions were pressed into the earth, almost like claw marks. Mark and I exchanged a worried glance, but we didn't speak about it. We thought it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a large dog, but the marks seemed too distinct, too deliberate. As we went on with the day, the odd feeling never left. That night, as we sat around the campfire, we noticed something strange in the distance. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was a shadow, or maybe just a trick of the light. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was a person. A tall figure, standing perfectly still, just watching us. Mark didn't see it at first, but when he turned to look, the figure was gone. We thought it was someone else from the RV park, maybe a late-night wanderer, but we never saw anyone else. As the night went on, we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and it felt like the entire forest was alive, watching us. We decided to go to bed early, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. In the middle of the night, I woke up again to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were right outside the RV, close enough that I could hear them shifting around the trailer. I woke Mark up, and we both listened in silence, our hearts pounding. We heard someone, or something, moving around the RV. It was too close, too real. But when Mark grabbed the flashlight and looked out the window, there was nothing there. The next morning, as we were packing up, we noticed more strange things. Our food had been moved around, some of the items out of place, and there was dirt on the counter that didn't belong. We hadn't left the RV all day. There was no way dirt could have gotten inside unless someone had been there. We felt completely violated, but when we looked around, The park was still as empty as it had been the day we arrived. We didn't talk much on the drive home. We were both shaken, and the strange feeling from the night before lingered long after we left the park. When we got back to the city, we decided to go through the photos we'd taken during the trip. As we scrolled through the pictures of the forest and the wildlife, we noticed something disturbing. In the background of a few photos, we could see the figure. The same tall, dark silhouette standing just out of view. We hadn't seen it when we were taking the pictures, but there it was, lurking in the shadows, almost like it had been following us the entire time. That's when we decided that we would never RV camp in West Virginia again. There was something off about that place, something we couldn't explain, and something we didn't want to understand. After everything we experienced, we knew it was best to stay away from that park, and I still get chills thinking about the strange figure in our photos. I've been a photographer for over a decade, traveling to all kinds of places, from bustling cities to remote wildernesses. The thrill of capturing nature's raw beauty has always driven me, and I've spent countless nights in campsites, RV parks, and off-the-beaten-path locations. But the trip I took to West Virginia was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It's the reason why I'll never RV camp there again. I was on a solo trip, looking for new locations to shoot some landscapes for a personal project I'd been working on. West Virginia had always intrigued me, with its dense forests, winding rivers, and rugged mountain terrain. I found a secluded RV park nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, away from the main tourist routes. It seemed perfect, remote, untouched, and exactly what I needed for my project. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my RV, and set up camp. The park was eerily quiet, not a single sound, aside from the wind rustling through the trees. There were a few other campers scattered around, but they kept to themselves and the place felt abandoned in a way. I didn't mind, I preferred it that way. As dusk fell, I grabbed my camera and went for a walk through the woods behind the RV park. The forest was beautiful, dense, ancient trees, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I spent hours wandering, snapping pictures of everything. The mist swirling around the base of the trees, the soft golden light filtering through the branches, and the jagged rocks that rose up from the creek. It was peaceful, hypnotic, and I was lost in the moment. I took some incredible shots, some of the best work I'd done in years. As I was returning to my RV just after dark, I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was another camper, but as I walked closer, the figure didn't move. It was too still, too silent. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, but something about it unsettled me. I snapped a photo of the figure with my camera, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked at the image, my stomach dropped. In the photo, the figure was clear as day. A tall, slender person, standing perfectly still, with a blank white face. No details, just a smooth, featureless surface where the face should have been. My heart raced. I knew I hadn't seen anyone there when I'd walked past. I hadn't heard anyone moving through the woods. I looked back up, but the figure was gone. It was as if it had vanished into the night. I didn't tell anyone about it. I thought it was probably some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light or a blur from the camera's motion. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I went through the photos I had taken the day before, hoping to find something that would explain the strange figure. That's when things took a darker turn. There were several shots of the forest, each with the same figure in the background, always standing motionless, always too far in the distance to see clearly with the naked eye. But in every single shot, the figure was there, always just beyond the trees, always watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had subconsciously taken the photos while the figure was there, but that didn't explain why I hadn't seen it in person. And it didn't explain why the figure was so perfectly still, so unnatural. Something about the face, that smooth, blank surface, sent chills down my spine. I decided to go back to the spot where I had seen the figure. I needed to understand what had happened. But when I arrived, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the trees seemed to press in on me from all sides. I walked the same path, took the same photos, but the place felt wrong. Every step I took, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was being watched again. It wasn't until later, when I returned to my RV, that I realized how truly unsettling the whole experience had been. The photos I had taken over the past couple of days had a strange quality to them, a sense of unease, like something was off just beneath the surface. In one shot, the trees seemed to lean in toward me, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of my presence. In another, I could swear I saw something moving in the background. Not a person, but something inhuman, something that didn't belong in the natural world. I packed up my RV that afternoon, my hands shaking as I loaded up my gear. I didn't care about the photos anymore. I didn't care about the project. All I could think about was getting out of that place. That was the last time I ever camped in West Virginia. The eerie silence, the figure in the woods, and those haunting photos. They were too much for me to ignore. Every time I think about it, I get a shiver down my spine. There's something in those woods, something I can't explain, something that doesn't want to be seen. And I'll never go back to try and understand it. I've been an avid camper for years, but after what happened to me in the mountains of West Virginia, I don't think I'll ever set foot in that place again. At least, not alone. I don't know what I saw, what I heard, or what I felt that night, but it was enough to make me pack up and leave before sunrise. It started as a simple trip. I had just gotten a few days off work and decided to take my RV out into the Monongahela National Forest. I'd read about a lesser-known spot tucked deep in the woods, a place where you could park right up against the edge of a rolling valley with a stunning view. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and untouched. The drive there was uneventful, though the roads became rougher the deeper I went. Eventually, I found the pull-off site I had read about online. It was even better than I expected. My RV sat at the edge of a drop-off that led down into miles of dense forest. The nearest town was over an hour away. Just me, my RV, and the wilderness. The first night was peaceful. I set up a small fire outside, cooked some food, and enjoyed the silence. The only sounds were the occasional hoots of owls and the rustling of the trees in the wind. But the second night? That's when everything changed. It started with the tapping. At first, I thought it was just twigs falling from the trees, a light tap, tap, tap against the side of my RV. Then it became more rhythmic, deliberate. I stepped outside with my flashlight but saw nothing. The wind had picked up, and I convinced myself it was just the branches moving. An hour later, as I lay in bed, I heard something heavier. Footsteps, slow, crunching movements circling my RV. I sat up, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the small window. Nothing. I opened the door and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods beyond were pitch black. "Hello?" I called out, though I immediately regretted it. My voice felt small against the vast darkness. No response. I listened, waiting, straining my ears. And then, just when I was about to turn back inside, I heard it. A whisper. Not words, not even a voice I could describe. Just a soft, guttural sound like something exhaling right next to me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But again, nothing. No movement, no figures. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and sat there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was the wind. I barely slept that night. Every so often I would hear soft scratching on the side of the RV. Then silence. Then more scratching. I didn't have the courage to look outside again. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun was up, the forest looked normal, and I was starting to feel ridiculous for how scared I had been. Maybe it really was just animals, or the wind. But before I packed up to leave, I decided to walk around the RV, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints. They circled my RV multiple times, and they weren't mine. They were barefoot, the impressions deep and uneven, as if whoever, whatever, had been walking there wasn't used to the terrain. I didn't stay to figure out who they belonged to. I threw everything into my RV, started the engine, and sped down that dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. But I do know one thing. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. My name is Daniel Whitaker, and I've been an avid camper for years. But after what happened to me in the mountains of West Virginia, I don't think I'll ever set foot in that place again. At least, not alone. I don't know what I saw, what I heard, or what I felt that night, but it was enough to make me pack up and leave before sunrise. It started as a simple trip. I had just gotten a few days off work and decided to take my RV out into the Monongahela National Forest. I'd read about a lesser-known spot tucked deep in the woods, a place where you could park right up against the edge of a rolling valley with a stunning view. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and untouched. The drive there was uneventful, though the roads became rougher the deeper I went. Eventually, I found the pull-off site I had read about online. It was even better than I expected. My RV sat at the edge of a drop-off that led down into miles of dense forest. The nearest town was over an hour away. Just me, my RV, and the wilderness. The first night was peaceful. I set up a small fire outside, cooked some food, and enjoyed the silence. The only sounds were the occasional hoots of owls and the rustling of the trees in the wind. But the second night? That's when everything changed. It started with the tapping. At first, I thought it was just twigs falling from the trees. A light tap, tap, tap against the side of my RV. Then it became more rhythmic, deliberate. I stepped outside with my flashlight but saw nothing. The wind had picked up, and I convinced myself it was just the branches moving. An hour later, as I lay in bed, I heard something heavier. Footsteps, slow, crunching movements circling my RV. I sat up, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the small window. Nothing. I opened the door and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods beyond were pitch black. "Hello," I called out, though I immediately regretted it. My voice felt small against the vast darkness. No response. I listened, waiting, straining my ears. And then, just when I was about to turn back inside, I heard it. A whisper. Not words, not even a voice I could describe. Just a soft, guttural sound, like something exhaling right next to me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But again, nothing. No movement, no figures. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and sat there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was the wind. I barely slept that night. Every so often, I would hear soft scratching on the side of the RV. Then silence, then more scratching. I didn't have the courage to look outside again. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted, but relieved. The sun was up, the forest looked normal, and I was starting to feel ridiculous for how scared I had been. Maybe it really was just animals or the wind. But before I packed up to leave, I decided to walk around the RV, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints. They circled my RV multiple times. And they weren't mine. They were barefoot, the impressions deep and uneven, as if whoever, whatever, had been walking there wasn't used to the terrain. I didn't stay to figure out who they belonged to. I threw everything into my RV, started the engine, and sped down that dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. But I do know one thing. I will never RV camp in West Virginia again. My name is Mark Ellison, and I've been a photographer for over 15 years. I specialize in landscape and nature photography, traveling to remote locations to capture the perfect shot. But there's one place I'll never return to, the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. What happened to me there still haunts me, and I don't think I'll ever truly understand it. I had read about an isolated clearing that overlooked a deep valley. The photos online were breathtaking, and I knew I had to see it for myself. I packed my gear, loaded up my SUV, and set off, planning to spend 2 nights in the area. The drive was long and winding, the roads becoming narrower the deeper I went into the wilderness. When I finally arrived, the sight was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The valley stretched endlessly, covered in thick fog that rolled like waves beneath the golden sunset. It was exactly what I was looking for. I set up my tent and started taking photos immediately. The light was perfect, and every shot I took felt like it belonged on a magazine cover. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and sat back, reviewing the images on my camera. That's when I noticed something strange. In the last few pictures I had taken of the valley, there was a figure standing near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe. But as I zoomed in, I felt my stomach drop. The figure was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. It stood perfectly still, watching from a distance. I looked up from my camera and shone my flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing, just trees swaying in the breeze. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe an anomaly in the lens or a weird reflection. I shook it off and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. My tent was silent except for the distant sound of crickets. But then I heard something else, a faint clicking noise. Not like an animal, not like the wind. A rhythmic, deliberate click, 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 circling my campsite. I held my breath, too afraid to move. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a soft whispering, just outside my tent. Not words, just the sound of something breathing, rasping. I bolted upright and grabbed my flashlight, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. My SUV was parked a few feet away, and beyond that, only darkness. My fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to reveal the outline of something, someone, standing at the edge of the trees. I scrambled for my camera, heart racing. Snapping a picture felt like the only way to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I took one shot. The flash illuminated the entire area for a brief second, and in that moment I saw it. It was closer now. No sound, no footsteps, just closer. Still motionless, still staring. I didn't stay to take another shot. I threw everything into my SUV, not even bothering to pack properly. I sped out of there, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I fled down the winding roads. When I got home, I uploaded the photos to my computer. The last image I took was blurred from my shaking hands, but the figure was still visible, still there. And the worst part? It had no eyes, but I knew it was looking right at me. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to West Virginia again.